There's a specific vocabulary covert narcissists rely on almost unconsciously, phrases so smooth and so socially acceptable on the surface that most people never think to question them, even when something about the exchange leaves them feeling strangely off afterward. Today, we're going to walk through the exact phrases that give a covert narcissist away in conversation. Not personality traits you'd need months to notice, but specific, listenable language you can start recognizing immediately once you understand what each phrase is actually designed to accomplish underneath its polite, reasonable-sounding surface. Let's start with why these phrases work so effectively in the first place, because understanding the mechanism explains why they're so easy to miss, even when you're specifically listening for red flags. Covert narcissism, unlike its more obvious, grandiose counterpart, operates through language that sounds humble, reasonable, even self-effacing, which means the usual warning signs people are trained to notice, like bragging or obvious arrogance, simply aren't present to trigger suspicion. What's actually happening underneath this reasonable-sounding language is a consistent pattern, managing your perception of the situation, protecting the covert narcissist from accountability, and subtly repositioning blame, all while sounding, on the surface, completely fair and measured. The first phrase, "I'm just being honest." This phrase deserves careful attention because of how effectively it disguises its actual function. On the surface, it sounds like a defense of integrity, someone simply committed to telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Listen closely to when it actually gets deployed, though, and a different pattern emerges. It almost never precedes genuinely necessary, carefully delivered feedback offered with real care for how it lands. It typically arrives immediately before or after something genuinely hurtful, functioning less as an explanation of motive and more as a preemptive shield against any pushback you might offer in response. "I'm just being honest, but you've really let yourself go," or "I'm just being honest, I don't think you're actually that talented." Notice that the phrase itself does no actual work toward making the statement kinder or more constructive. It simply reframes cruelty as virtue, positioning any objection you might raise as an attack on honesty itself, rather than a reasonable response to being hurt. The second phrase, "You're too sensitive." We've discussed this one before in earlier videos, but it's worth including here specifically because of how reliably it appears in covert narcissistic conversation as a conversation-ending tool rather than a genuine observation. Listen for how quickly this phrase gets deployed after you express any form of hurt, discomfort, or disagreement, often within a single exchange, sometimes before you've even finished explaining what bothered you. Its actual function isn't diagnostic, it's redirective, instantly shifting the conversation away from whatever behavior triggered your response and onto your supposed inability to handle normal interaction. Once you start listening for it specifically, you'll notice it rarely gets applied consistently. The same person rarely tells you you're too sensitive about things that don't personally implicate their own behavior, which reveals its actual function clearly once you compare enough instances side by side. The third phrase, "I don't see it that way, but okay." This one is subtler and worth understanding carefully because it sounds, on the surface, like genuine conflict resolution, someone acknowledging a difference of perspective and moving forward gracefully. Listen to the tone and the timing, though, because the actual function is often quite different. This phrase frequently arrives not as genuine acceptance of a differing viewpoint, but as a way of ending a conversation while implicitly marking your perspective as simply wrong, without ever actually engaging with why. The "but okay" does significant work here. It signals resigned tolerance rather than genuine consideration, positioning the speaker as the reasonable one humoring an unreasonable position, while avoiding the actual substance of the disagreement entirely. The fourth phrase, "After everything I've done for you." This phrase deserves careful listening because of how directly it functions as an emotional ledger. one that only ever seems to get invoked when it serves the covert narcissist's immediate purpose. Notice that it rarely surfaces during moments of genuine connection or gratitude. It appears specifically in moments of conflict, disagreement, or when you're attempting to hold a boundary, functioning as a kind of debt collection designed to make you feel guilty enough to abandon whatever you were originally asking for or objecting to. The specific power of this phrase lies in its vagueness. It rarely accompanies a specific named example of what's actually being referenced, because specificity would invite scrutiny about whether the everything in question was actually as generous or unconditional as the phrase implies. The fifth phrase, wow, okay then. This short, seemingly simple response deserves attention specifically because of its brevity and its precise emotional temperature. Listen for how it gets deployed immediately after you've stated a boundary, declined a request, or expressed a need that doesn't align with what the covert narcissist wanted. The phrase itself carries an unmistakable undertone of wounded, performed shock, functioning to make your entirely reasonable response feel like it's caused genuine offense or hurt, without the speaker ever having to articulate specifically what about your response was actually a problem. Let's continue with 5 more phrases worth listening for, because the full pattern only becomes truly recognizable once you understand how these expressions work together across an entire conversation rather than as isolated moments. The 6th phrase, "That's not what I meant. You're twisting my words." This phrase is worth listening for, specifically in the context of when it arrives, not after a genuine misunderstanding where clarification would naturally follow, but often immediately after you've accurately paraphrased something that was, in fact, said clearly and directly. Notice that this phrase rarely comes paired with an actual clarification of what was meant instead. It functions primarily as a redirection, converting a conversation about accountability for something said into a conversation about your supposed inability to listen or comprehend accurately. Over time, repeated exposure to this phrase, deployed regardless of how carefully or accurately you've actually represented what was said, produces exactly the kind of self-doubt we've discussed throughout this series. A gradual erosion of trust in your own ability to accurately perceive and remember conversations, even when your memory was entirely correct to begin with. The 7th phrase, "I guess I'm just a bad person then." This phrase deserves careful attention because of how effectively it weaponizes self-deprecation as a conversational tool. On the surface, it sounds like genuine, if excessive, self-criticism, someone taking your concerns seriously to an almost extreme degree. Listen to what actually happens next, though, because the function becomes clear quickly. This statement almost never gets followed by genuine reflection on the specific behavior in question. It gets followed by your reassurance, your comfort, your walking back of whatever concern you originally raised, because the discomfort of watching someone spiral into apparent self-loathing typically overrides your original point entirely. This phrase is one of the most effective conversation derailing tools available precisely because objecting to it, pointing out that you never called them a bad person, simply named a specific behavior, can itself feel cruel in the moment, even though recognizing the pattern reveals it as a highly effective diversion tactic rather than genuine vulnerability. The 8th phrase, "Everyone always turns on me eventually." This phrase is worth listening for, specifically because of what it reveals about pattern recognition, not yours but theirs, even though it's rarely delivered with any genuine self-reflective insight attached. Listen for how this statement gets used to position an accumulating pattern of relationship failures as evidence of the world's unfairness, rather than evidence worth examining honestly. What's worth noticing specifically is the passive construction, "everyone turns on me," rather than any version acknowledging a possible common denominator across every one of these relationships. This phrase functions to preemptively frame you, the current listener, as someone likely to eventually join this long list of people who turned on them, subtly positioning your own future doubts or boundaries as further evidence of a pattern that's actually about you, rather than an invitation to examine what's actually happening across all these relationships. The ninth phrase, "I was just joking, relax." This phrase is worth listening for, specifically in the context of comments that land with real, visible discomfort. Moments where something said clearly registered as hurtful, followed immediately by this specific retroactive reframe. Notice that genuine jokes delivered with actual comedic intent don't typically require this kind of defensive clarification after the fact, because their humorous intent was usually clear from tone and context in the moment itself. This phrase functions specifically to invalidate your genuine reaction to something that landed as hurtful, converting your accurate emotional response into evidence of your own inability to take a joke, while simultaneously allowing the original comment to stand without ever requiring an actual apology or acknowledgement of its impact. The 10th phrase, "I never said that." This final phrase deserves attention specifically because of its flat, absolute denial, deployed even in situations where there's clear, sometimes documented evidence to the contrary. Listen for how confidently and immediately this phrase gets used, often without any pause for genuine reflection on what was actually said, because its function isn't really about accurate recollection at all. It's about establishing, in the moment, an alternate version of events that requires you to either produce concrete evidence to counter it or abandon the point entirely rather than continue arguing against flat, confident denial. This phrase, more than perhaps any other on this list, reveals the deepest function all 10 of these expressions ultimately share: protecting a specific version of reality where accountability never actually has to land, regardless of how clearly the actual facts might contradict it. Now let's bring these 10 phrases together into what actually matters most, because recognizing individual expressions is useful, but understanding the underlying pattern that connects all of them is what actually protects you going forward in conversations you haven't had yet with people you haven't met yet, rather than simply helping you look backward at conversations you've already lived through. Here's the thread running underneath every single phrase we've discussed today. Each one functions to prevent a specific outcome: genuine, unguarded accountability for a specific behavior in a specific moment with specific consequences attached. Whether it's "I'm just being honest," preemptively shielding cruelty from criticism, or "I never said that," flatly denying documented reality, or "I guess I'm just a bad person then," converting accountability into a performance requiring your comfort instead. Every one of these 10 phrases accomplishes the same underlying goal through a different specific mechanism. This is worth understanding as the actual transferable skill this video is meant to give you, because covert narcissists don't all use exactly these 10 phrases in exactly this form. The specific wording varies from person to person, sometimes significantly. What stays consistent, almost universally, is the underlying function: language that sounds reasonable, sometimes even sounds humble or vulnerable, while actually working to prevent genuine accountability from ever fully landing. This is worth understanding because it means the actual skill worth building isn't memorizing these exact 10 phrases and listening for their precise wording. It's developing a more general capacity to notice this underlying function, regardless of the specific words used to accomplish it. Ask yourself, in any conversation that leaves you feeling subtly unsettled without being able to immediately articulate why, did this response actually engage with the specific thing I raised, or did it redirect the conversation somewhere else entirely, usually toward my reaction, my perception, or their own comfort? This single question, applied consistently across enough conversations, will reveal this pattern far more reliably than memorizing any specific list of phrases ever could, because it targets the actual mechanism rather than its surface level expression. Here's something worth naming directly, because it's an important caveat to everything we've discussed today. Not every instance of these phrases indicates covert narcissism. People say, "I'm just being honest," or "that's not what I meant," for entirely genuine, non-manipulative reasons constantly in the ordinary give and take of normal human communication, including from people who love you well and hold no manipulative intent whatsoever. What actually matters isn't whether a specific phrase gets used once in isolation. It's whether a consistent pattern emerges, the same functions, redirecting accountability away from the same person across enough different conversations and enough different contexts that coincidence becomes an increasingly unlikely explanation. One instance of any of these phrases is simply language. A consistent, repeated pattern across dozens of conversations, always protecting the same person from the same kind of accountability, is information worth taking seriously. If you're recognizing several of these phrases in a relationship you're currently navigating, I want you to understand what this recognition actually offers you, because it's genuinely valuable even without requiring you to make any immediate dramatic decision about the relationship itself. It gives you the ability to notice in real time when a conversation is being redirected away from genuine accountability, which means you can choose deliberately whether to follow that redirection or gently, calmly bring the conversation back to its original point. This doesn't guarantee the other person will actually engage honestly once redirected back. Often, based on everything we've discussed today, they won't, at least not initially. But it does protect you from the specific cumulative damage of years spent unconsciously absorbing these redirections without ever noticing they were happening, which is precisely the damage this recognition is actually designed to prevent. This is ultimately the real value of understanding these 10 phrases and every pattern underneath them. Not becoming suspicious of everyone who occasionally uses similar language, but developing genuine, reliable discernment about when accountability is actually landing in your conversations and when it's being smoothly, skillfully redirected instead. That discernment, once built, doesn't require you to catch every single instance perfectly or call out every redirection in the moment it happens. It simply requires you to notice over time whether a pattern is genuinely there and trust what you notice, even when the individual phrases, heard one at a time, sound reasonable enough that questioning them might feel in the moment unfair. You don't owe anyone the benefit of the doubt indefinitely, especially not when the pattern keeps repeating in ways specifically designed to make questioning it feel unreasonable. Trust what you're actually hearing underneath how reasonable it sounds on the surface. That trust, built carefully over time, is worth more than any single list of phrases could ever be on its own.